Hi there, it's Lisa from A Lovely Life, coming to you today with the second installment around control and micromanagement. So, I want to bring forward one principle and four steps that you can take to shift this behavior in your leadership approach. So, I'm going to start with a bit of a story around the principle. The principle came as a result of something that my husband told me when we were very first together. So I'm married to a very lovely man named Ray, and we've been together 17 years, married 12, together 5 prior. And you may or may not know about me, my friends and family certainly do, that I am pretty competitive and I am also sometimes quite controlling. So I certainly relate to this topic in a wholehearted way. And because I've really had to work to overcome it in my leadership style. So he said to me very early on, I can ask him to do something or I can tell him how to do it, but I don't get to do both. And I thought it was so bang on and so simple. I thought, oh, right, that makes sense. So for my teams, I think about it in I'm either asking them to do something because I think they have the right experience, they have the right access to tools, they have the right access to resources, whatever it is, I'm asking them to do it because I believe they can do it. So let me ask and get out of their way and they will do it. If I need to tell somebody to do something, you know, potentially because a piece of work is needing to be structured in a certain way, so a marketing campaign has to be very within a brand box, or a board report needs to be very much within a certain format, whatever that may be, I may have to give more direction with that. And if that's the case, as long as I'm really clear on what the outcome is and what I'm expecting along the way, that's great. They'll be able to execute that too, no problem. But I don't get to do both because that's when it can be really disempowering to your people when you ask them to do something and then they start doing it and you step in. It's okay. This is the way to do it, and then you start telling them how to do it. That's when you see people back off and go, oh, okay, I guess she's got it. So that's the disempowering, disengaging piece of why control and micromanagement is not a very productive leadership behavior at all. So beyond the principle, there's four key steps that I really take in the approach of how I had to approach changing this in my own leadership style. So the first one is to get curious. Just get so curious that you don't stop asking questions. I'm just curious why you use that piece of data. I wouldn't have thought about that. Or I'm curious as to, why you thought that format was a really good one. It's interesting how it shows this piece of, data. Or um, I thought it was interesting asked that certain stakeholder. I didn't think about them. Had you thought about this other person? By asking questions, instead of having the power dynamic that control and micromanagement often give of I'm up here telling you what to do and you're presumably down there just taking the orders, which is not an engaging place to be. What the questioning does is it puts you more on an even playing field and puts you in the proverbial circle together. And that's where collaboration, creativity, and ultimately better quality work comes from. So you really want to think about just get curious, ask questions, and fight that urge to give answers. It's hard. It is hard and you're going to slip, but even if you get 70-30, it's better than 70-30 the other way, where you're 30% asking questions, 70% directing. Switch it around, 70 questions, 30 directing, and you'll already be ahead. The second thing that you really want to think about in this approach is you want to think about what's actually important to you as a leader. And sometimes I think we really fail on this front as leaders. We think about, we have to control both the process and the result. But I guess my question is, do we? What are we being held accountable for? More often than not, we are being held accountable for the results that are produced, the performance. That's really what we're accountable to deliver within an organization through our teams. So if that's the case, what really matters to you? Is it the result or is it the process? because your leader is holding you accountable to deliver the results and the performance. They may not ever ask you a question, especially if they're not a controlling, micromanaging leader. They may never ask you a question of how you got there. They just are like, great, this is great work from you and your team. Awesome, move on. But if you put equal weight on both of those, it really puts you in a place that you have no other choice but to kind of get in the weeds with your team too much. What you should be focused on as a leader is the performance and the results at the end, not always controlling the path of how to get there. Doesn't mean you can't guide, doesn't mean you can't coach and direct, but it does mean you have to get out of the way, because the path will be delivered by the people closest to that work. So think about what's really important, the path or the results, and make sure you have your priorities straight and clear for yourself. The third thing that I really think is interesting, that sometimes leaders will push back when I say, okay, if you want to overcome this behavior, ask questions, get really clear about what your focus is, results or a process. And they say, well, I have to ask, I have to check in, I have to stay on top of things. Yes, you do. That's your role as a leader. Checking in, though, is different than jumping in. And so absolutely, as a leader, you're expected, and I'm sure your team expects you, to check in with them. How are things going? Have you come across any obstacles? But that doesn't mean that you're coming in, checking in, and as soon as you get one sniff that things are off track, you're jumping in and directing it all around. If I have somebody on my team that I'm asking on a check-in, they seem to, be really late delivering me communication on something that needs to go out. I haven't really seen a plan for this, project that has to be delivered in, 2 months, and I haven't even seen a plan. I might start to think, okay, I need to check in and see where this is at. I will often ask that person, okay, at our next one-on-one or on Tuesday, let's talk about, bring me what you've got and some drafts of anything you've got, and let's talk about your progress. So they do that, and then we again go back to that step one. I start asking a lot of questions. Well, will the end user be able to understand this if we don't have this, and this communication ahead? They go, oh, okay, no. Right, so build this communication out. It really starts to kind of make sure that you're working again with your team, coaching and supporting them instead of directing them, because that is the piece that is most disengaging, I really think, for teams. And then finally, the last step is you've got to think about what is actually the worst thing that can happen. So I often think about this as, if you were maybe an Xer or a boomer, our parents may have said to us, if you don't behave, you're really going to get it. You're really going to be in big trouble. Well, they never really told us what big trouble was. But for most of us, especially kids with any sort of imagination, we could probably imagine what that was, and it didn't seem good. So if you were me, you just, came into line and were, I didn't want to get in the big trouble. Same for leaders. Leaders can often hyperbolize what the worst case scenario is. So if you ask yourself, okay, so a piece of work is late. That's not ideal, but what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Piece of work isn't the best quality. Not ideal. What's the worst thing that can happen? Piece of work is wrong. What's the worst thing that can happen? And then if you put it against, and there's lots of different methods of this, and I use 5 minutes, 5 months, 5 years. If a piece of work is late, is it going to make a difference in 5 minutes? Is it going to make a difference in 5 months? Is it going to make a difference in 5 years? It'll help put into context how much you should be reacting to something that, maybe isn't perfect. Because the reality is a lot of things aren't going to be perfect. So if you can kind of create some realistic boundaries around what that worst thing is, you can then start to just, relax. You're going to immediately think about taking less control, because you can start to realize, okay, it's not it's not the end of the world. There's very few things. I mean, I suppose if you were a pilot, maybe, or something that you were like a doctor and it's really life saving, or a surgeon or something like that. Those are perhaps more, life saving situations. But for many of us in corporate jobs or things like that, there's really the worst case scenario is probably not as serious as we're making it out to be. And when we make it out to be super serious, that's what impacts our teams. Creates stress. It can create a sense of unsafe, like people feel not safe in the work environment because, everything's so edgy because everything means so much. So I really just encourage leaders to think about, like, what's the worst thing that can happen. And as soon as you can do that and normalize failure a little bit, because we all have to fail, we all have to make mistakes, it is just the reality of growth, it really will put things into context. So if you take the principle, the 4 steps, and implement one of the steps and think about the principle in your everyday practice, I really do think you can shift this behavior for yourself. When you shift it, it'll make a big difference for your team, and it will make a big difference in the quality of work and the output overall. So with that, I hope you found this helpful and valuable. If you liked this content and want to check out some of my other content, please check me out at alovelylife.ca and have a lovely day.